It's Steve Baenziger, and I'm with the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. Well, my formal title is Professor and Nebraska Wheat Growers Presidential Chair. My average day is, I like to come in early, so I usually come in at about 6:45, and I take care of all the correspondence from yesterday's evening, because it's a 24-hour clock now anymore. I go down to my greenhouse. I usually work 2 to 3 hours. If it's a busy day, 4 hours in the greenhouse. That's making crosses, emasculating to set up for crosses for 2 days later, things like that. Unfortunately, there's a new race of rust that's coming out of Africa. It's called UG99, first discovered in Uganda in 1999. And it's basically a highly mutable race, and it's basically attacking virtually every gene we have. So we're adding a whole bunch of new genes. So that's one. Every year we have leaf rust, and that's in the eastern part of the state. In the western part of the state, we often have wheat streak mosaic virus, so we're working on that disease. We also have barley yellow dwarf virus across the state. We have soil-borne mosaic virus in the eastern part of the state. We have stripe rust, usually it's more common in the west than in the east. So we have that. And then you have the standard, what we would call non-diseases, but threats, heat and drought, or winter kill. What people don't recognize is that in my lifetime, I was born in 1951, there was a book called The Population Bomb. It was a bestseller in 1968. And it said that basically, that it didn't matter what we were going to embark on now. There will be starvation where hundreds of millions of people will starve, and it'll happen in the 1970s. Now, for those of you that are young, you don't remember the great famines in the 1970s, do you? It's because they didn't occur. And the reason why they didn't occur is because there were two wonderful scientists, teams of scientists, but the lead scientist at CIMMYT was Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Prize. He developed the Green Revolution in wheat. And then an alumnus of the University of Nebraska, Henry Beechel, known as Hank by most of us, Hank did the same thing in rice, made an IR8. He was the breeder of that. And so they bought time for 35 years. Now, if you were in India, where 40 million people did starve to death in the late 40s, early 50s, basically almost the same number of people starved to death there as we lost in World War II, they were looking at less than 1 ton per hectare, which would be about 15 bushel per acre wheat. Okay? They're now growing probably 3 to 4 tons per hectare, 45 to 60 bushel per acre wheat. So we've increased in the span of 1968 roughly till now the wheat of most of the world by threefold. We will need to increase more than that in the next, today's 2012, next 38 years. We're going to have to increase more than that by percent. But the difference is that we can probably pretty much get about 150 kilograms per hectare, or that would be, let me think about that, it's about 2-3 bushels per acre. That's even that's high. It's probably about 2 bushels per acre. We can probably get a lot of that through agronomics and breeding, but the percentage is much lower. And so if you look at the projected rates of gain that they're asking agronomists, people who manage our crops, and breeders, the one who breed them, we are looking at something which is absolutely unprecedented. Never in the history of the world have we seen growth like this, except during the Green Revolution by a percent basis. And that percent basis was on 1 ton per hectare crops. Now we have to have the same percentage on 3 ton per hectare crops. So if you think you had a 1% gain per year, well, that was on a 1 ton, that would be 10 kilograms per hectare. On a 3 ton, that's 30 kilograms per hectare. We're going to do it with probably less water. We're going to do it with probably less fertilizer. So if I were a policymaker, I would say invest in agriculture now, because you're going to need it, not today necessarily, but in 10 years from now, absolutely. And the trend lines are all wrong as are the investments. The best news is, quite frankly, that the investment in the private sector is robust. And as such, maybe that's what they're hoping to do. But for a lot of areas which are not friendly to industry, to corporations, the resources that are needed relative to the challenges that we know are to be expected are totally underfunded.
And how do we meet that demand without ruining the environment?
Well, the way you're going to have to do it is the way we've done it in the past, which is intensive agriculture. If you think about it, we're not creating new land, okay? And in fact, we're probably losing land at about the same rate as we might be. So for every irrigated acre we add due to new water projects, globally we lose about an acre due to salinity, poor use of that irrigated water. So the question then is, you're going to have to increase that yield for 50% more people with the same amount of land, less water, less nitrogen. To me, it says you're going to have to do much better management of the resources you have, and you're going to have much better genetics so that you can have much higher yields. But where most of the gains will be in the well-managed fields. And if you look at the Green Revolution, that was fertilizer and irrigation, and that's what we're going to have to concentrate again on. If you had the yields of 1968 and tried to feed today's population, you would run out of land. So we just have to be much more productive per acre. You know, the story of more crop per drop, it's more crop per land also.
Is there anything else that you think that people should really know about what you do or plant genetics?
I don't know. I mean, it seems like we covered a lot of stuff. I mean, is there anything that you'd like to hear? You have a question or two? Looks like we have some from the audience. Okay, good.
IANR wanted to be sure that we included you in the magazine that we're putting together about food scarcity. You are the recognized face of plant genetics at UNL. Why do you think IANR thought that you were a seminal part of this particular magazine?
Well, I always hate to speculate on the thoughts of others. I guess if they think that I deserve to be part of the magazine, it's probably because we have been successful with the resources we've been given in creating a favorable impression of the university, having an economic impact to our growers and our millers and our bakers. You know, I think to be the steward of the wheat program, and wheat's one of the last great public sector crops. So I think that's something which has happened. At the same time, we've been very fortunate in that we've been able to work with some wonderful companies, and I think that gets us into an economic development issue. And then finally, my heart's always been, and what I always intended to do, was to work overseas and try to feed the people who needed the food the most. Never quite got there, but I also have got there sort of tangentially by serving on the Board of Trustees of the International Rice Research Institute. Outside of the Director General of IRRI, I'm the only American on that board. I serve on the Wheat Yield Consortium for CIMMYT, for wheat, and on their Technical Advisory Committee. So I've always given freely of my time to what I consider those most directly involved with the third world and development. And so perhaps I think they've always appreciated. I know they've always been most generous with allowing me to do that with the time that I have at the university. So perhaps that's why.
Wonderful. That actually moves right into the next question I have for you. I'd like to know what motivates you, and also what legacy you'd like to leave in the industry in agriculture and in plant breeding.
Okay, well, what motivates me is, I don't have the figures right handy, but if you looked at the 2010 wheat crop, okay, it's large enough that it would feed 20 million people their annual consumption of wheat in the U.S., based on our consumption standards. Now, that's, I think, great for Nebraska. A state that has roughly 2 million people can feed 10 times it for a relatively small acreage crop. I mean, we're a large wheat state, but we're not large like the corn in this area is, or the soybeans. Now, as a breeder, I can't take credit for that, but if you look at the genetic increase, okay, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like about 4.2 million people get fed due to genetics, okay? Roughly a little over 20% of that yield or that total production is due to genetic gains since Scout 66 was released. Now, I still can't take credit for all of that because that's all the breeders in the Great Plains. But if you look at our percentage market share at the time, it was about 66%, 67%. It means that the genetics program at the University of Nebraska for wheat varieties that we have released that are grown in Nebraska, we feed about 2.1, 2.3 million people. That's why I got into agriculture, was to feed people. And so to me, this is living the dream, okay? So that's what motivates me. Now, you get some wonderful fringe benefits from that. I mean, the ability to serve on international boards is wonderful. To me, the reason why you're at university is to teach. And even though I may be best known as a researcher, I hope I will be equally well known as a teacher. And so if someone wondered what my legacy will be, it'll be, sure, my wheat varieties, barley, triticale, but the real legacy is going to be the students. They're the ones that'll be the next generation that, you know, in disparate lands will be making a difference for their countries. In America, you know, some are with major companies, some are with the USDA, some are at major universities. And so if you look at it, it's the ability to shape lives. Now, we do it, you know, with what we feed people, and half our wheat crop is exported. So we change a lot of lives that way. You never know who they are, and that's fine. We don't care. It's, you know, you didn't get in this business for glory, okay? But at the same time, you directly have a first-hand touch on your students. And that'd be probably the legacy we will leave will be theirs. And then the last thing I guess I would say is the other legacy is perhaps an attitude. And that is that anyone that works on wheat's a friend of ours. That doesn't matter if they're industry, public sector, non-profit governmental organization. You know, we are the People's University, and we take that very seriously.
Wonderful. Would you have a short list of countries today that have benefited from your research, from wheat germs that you've shared and from your students?
Okay, so if you look at the countries where the University of Nebraska historically has shared germplasm with that has been beneficial, it would be Turkey. And that's a huge wheat-producing country in the Middle East and Europe and Asia. We have actually released a variety by my predecessor there, and we've given a lot of their germplasm to them, and they've given germplasm to us. We've also released a variety in South Africa, and it's, you know, we share our germplasm there. We share our germplasm with CIMMYT, and they share it then globally also. Where my students come from, and my goal is when I retire, if I'm still physically able, is to visit them all. So I have students in Thailand, I have a student in Japan, students in India, students in Jordan, a number of students in Turkey, students in Costa Rica, students in Mexico, a number of students across the U.S., of course, none from Canada that I'm aware of. So, and of course Pakistan also, Bangladesh also. Well, I'm trying to think, Brunei, that's a bit unusual, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco. I've had students who've worked with me on, not for graduate degrees, but for learning experiences from South Africa. A lot of good students from Ethiopia. So we've increased in the span of 1968 roughly till now the wheat of most of the world by threefold. We will need to increase more than that in the next, today's 2012, next 38 years. We're going to have to increase more than that by percent. And then finally, my heart's always been, and what I always intended to do, was to work overseas and try to feed the people who needed the food the most. Never quite got there, but I also have got there sort of tangentially by serving on the Board of Trustees of the International Rice Research Institute. Outside of the Director General of IRRI, I'm the only American on that board. I serve on the Wheat Yield Consortium for CIMMYT for wheat and on their technical advisory committee. So I've always given freely of my time to what I consider those most directly involved with the third world and development.